Okay, welcome to, I don't know what this is going to be, but this is our channel for Murray Distributed Technologies, which is the parent company of Brightview. We're going to start recording podcasts weekly. We're joined this week with Steve Shadders. Steve, thank you for hopping on here. And I thought before we get into anything technical or Bitcoiny, I first became, well, I guess I became aware of your history, I guess, and how you became involved in Bitcoin a long time ago. You've shared that story a good bit. But what I always found really interesting was how you got a job at nChain, which I have yet to hear you tell that publicly, even though I think it's a really cool story. But could you mention how you got started at nChain to begin with? And I guess you could give a little bit of background before that, because I know you used to write software for Bitcoin J, I think. I know
hmm
I met your colleague and friend, Brad. He told me some really interesting stories about the mining pool software you guys, I don't know if you wrote it together or separately or what, but um, and he tells me that story kind of like with a Dr. Evil laugh. So could you maybe start there and then your evolution into working at nChain?
Sure. So I actually took a long break from Bitcoin for a few years. Part of that involved um, my process of coming to terms with the loss of an insignificant amount of Bitcoin. And for a while, I never wanted to hear the word Bitcoin again. But in my sort of earlier days, I wrote pool software and I contributed a lot to Bitcoin J. And I got into a blazing argument with Mike Hearn once because I wanted to turn Bitcoin J into a node implementation. At the time, it was focused on SPV, and he thought that was a terrible idea at the time. And to be fair to him, he was backed up by Satoshi on that point. So anyway, I never quite got around to doing that. But fast forward a few years, Brad's actually the one who was responsible for dragging me somewhat kicking and screaming back into the Bitcoin world in 2017. He talked me into starting a mining pool, which was more, I guess, an exercise for me in testing out whether I was sort of still keen and interested in Bitcoin. And whether I had gotten past my mental blockages there. But, through that process, I somehow ran into Craig on the internet, and he sort of learned a bit more about my history, claims to have known more about my history before he met me than I thought, although I don't know for sure about that. And I was living in Australia at the time and started doing some work for nChain, and it wasn't too long before I'd met some nChain people on a business trip that we all had to take to Japan. And shortly after that, discussion started around me moving over to London. I wasn't meant to move over there to take the job that I'm kind of doing, but it was a different role. But I sort of found myself in a technical strategy and leadership role fairly quickly, which certainly pushed me out of my comfort zone. For years, I enjoyed being kind of a lone wolf developer. I'm more of a machine person than a people person. I'm sure some people at nChain would agree with that. But yeah, we found ourselves here, and then it was only 2-3 months after I had moved to London that it became apparent that we had a hash war to deal with upcoming. And I suppose, given the prior experience that I'd had with something that was a node-like implementation, even though not quite a node with Bitcoin J, my skill set, I suppose, was a natural fit to lead the formation of the Bitcoin SV team. Yeah. So that's roughly the story.
And I remember we had, I guess, recorded something with you and Daniel Connolly. I guess, was that 3 years ago now? 3 years ago?
About that, yeah.
When the SV node implementation first was announced, right? And that was a very uncertain time. So interesting time to get thrown into the mix for you, right?
I mean, it was a politically volatile time, and it kind of marked the beginning of my Bitcoin, my public Bitcoin career, I suppose, as being one of the least popular public figures in the Bitcoin Cash world.
Yeah, that
But
happened quickly, huh? It was very quick.
well, yeah, I mean, I had actually been actively working with a lot of the Bitcoin Cash, other Bitcoin Cash implementation teams, sort of as Enchain's community representative, I suppose. So I had actually formed some, good relationships with some of the people in ABC, Bitcoin Unlimited, and many others. And some of whom I still occasionally have a friendly chat to. But obviously, ideological lines make it very difficult for some friendships to survive, which is a sad consequence of it. But the doing Bitcoin properly, I suppose, was more important to me. So that was a choice that I had to make.
Sure. Well, maybe we can start with the, I guess the evolution of the node software, the SV node software from when it was announced in 2018, but now we have the latest release of version 1.0.9, which has 3 release note pieces to it. The first is the notification of Doublespend. So you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so we actually already have features in place to deal with what I call a broadcast doublespend, which is where 2 versions of a transaction that spend the same inputs are broadcast at a similar time to each other. And it's probably one of my first public presentations I ever did talked about the doublespend problem, and I broke them down into 2 categories. There was this broadcast doublespend, which we already addressed with a doublespend notification feature in it's a combination of MAPI and the Bitcoin node software that allows that to happen. But that catches double spends before they're confirmed. So the idea is a merchant receives a transaction if a double spend happens within a few milliseconds and it has any chance of being accepted, then the merchant will know within a few milliseconds. If a double spend is broadcast a couple of minutes later, then if the transaction's propagated across the network, it shouldn't matter because it'll be rejected by all of the honest miners. Now, this double spend notification feature is slightly different. It addresses the other form of double spend, which I call a collusion double spend. That's where a miner has to be involved in this, actively involved in this. A miner sees the original transaction but chooses to ignore it, which is direct violation of the white paper, which said the first seen transaction should be the valid one. So they ignore that rule, I suppose, of the white paper through whatever means or mechanisms are available to them. They would have to take active steps in order to be able to do this, and then they attempt to secretly mine that transaction. They don't bother broadcasting it out to the rest of the world because they're relying on the fact that if it's included in a block, they assume other miners will accept it. But as we saw in recent reorg attacks, it was very obvious when someone's hiding, mining a long chain of blocks and keeping them hidden that there's nefarious intent, which has sort of subsequently been confirmed. So what this feature actually does is it will provide notifications where there are 2 blocks in different branches of the blockchain that where double spends occur. So you have common blockchain up to here, and then it branches off, and there's a transaction on this side and a transaction on this side that both spend the same input. So our previous feature wouldn't have caught that situation, but this one now does. The actual detection logic is not actually built into the Bitcoin node. We wanted to get this out quickly because obviously has improved security across the whole network. That's actually generated by a separate tool, which we call the double spend detection and notifier. DS-Dan. I can't remember exactly what it stands for.
Detection and notification service.
Detection and notification service, yes, which will eventually make available so other people can run instances of it. But the key point is it generates a proof of double spend that is verifiable by the node or by anyone else, and it involves additional peer-to-peer messages to allow these to be broadcast out. Because they're included in a block, there's a significant cost involved in creating these double spends, so we can broadcast this message across the network without any sort of spam concerns or whatnot. And it's a slightly different scenario when we're talking about broadcast double spends, because when a broadcast double spend is never going to be included in a block, it means that whatever fee is attached to it will never be paid. So there's nothing stopping you generating billions of these and having them all broadcast out across the network. So we have to deal with those two different situations in two different ways.
And so these messages are triggered by the node or by the miner, right? Not necessarily by the node, or is the node software going to just, if it sees it, automatically trigger the message and send it to
yeah, the node software will receive one of these notifications that's generated by the DS-Dan service. It actually will perform a validation on it to confirm that it is actually a real double spend in two different blocks that actually have real proof of work. If it's valid, then they'll broadcast it out to everybody else they're connected to. So this will propagate across the whole network to ensure everyone knows about it very quickly. We only announce one double spend transaction per block because it's generally enough to know there's something fishy going on. But the node can also call out to a webhook interface, so you can configure whatever you want to listen to these. And if you've got systems, if you're an exchange, for example, that webhook might trigger your own internal alerting system or whatnot.
Okay, and so I guess that leads into the second piece of the update, which was safe mode processing, including notification of unusual activity of the network, for example, competing chains and double spends. So it looks like this logic is what, an RPC hook?
Well, we've added webhooks to that feature as well. So the previous version, I guess, of safe mode, it was there for well, let's just say reasons which are different to what we actually think is useful. And so, it had hard-coded settings in terms of what the maximum fork distance was and minimum fork lengths and things like that, that didn't kind of really make sense. So, in some cases during recent reorg issues, it didn't actually trigger. We've also seen it trigger in cases where that were, of kind of little consequence. So we've done some work to make that configurable, put some sensible defaults in place, as well as give you the option of being able to switch it off if you've confirmed that it's a false alarm. But again, we've also attached that to a webhook, so you don't have to sit there looking at the RPC interface to know. Because that's all that it actually did previously. It would just show up a message when you call get info on the RPC interface, which I'm sure most people would have missed.
And so, if I remember correctly, back in the Bitcoin Cash days, there was maybe it was Bitcoin Unlimited was working on like double spend proofs, but if I remember correctly, they were trying to make it part of consensus. Is that right? Like, what was the back then, wasn't there a ton of argument and debate over whatever it is that they were trying to do? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I think there's two separate issues. They were working on double spend proofs, and they've actually implemented something along those lines. That wasn't a consensus issue, though. The way we actually looked closely at the way that they did double spend proofs, because they were also trying to solve the network flooding problem. And the way that they solved it was essentially to construct a fairly complex proof that was very limited in scope. It's only applicable to pay to public key hash transactions and a very limited set of multi-sig style transactions. We obviously wanted something that was a little more universal than that, because there's so much flexibility in terms of the types of scripts you can create with Bitcoin SV. So we opted for a different approach. The other part, which is where the real controversy kicked off, was the notion of pre-consensus. This is where nodes try to agree on what a block should look like before the block is actually mined. And this was, obviously a substantial point of contention, because it's kind of a lightweight way of trying to achieve what Bitcoin achieves anyway. And it's an attempt to, gain finality faster. But what it overlooks is the possibility, is the fact that Bitcoin SV, when it's configured properly as a small world network, can give you that finality in a very short space of time, within 2 network hops.
Yeah. So, and I guess maybe that's maybe the distinction here, right? Because when we're talking about double spends in these contexts, you're talking about collusion type double spends, where the miners are kind of actively engaged in this, but the double spends that people have been like theorizing as an attack vector on Bitcoin forever, since Satoshi wrote the vending machine thread, I guess, is more of a merchant problem, right? It's more of a, who cares about the double spend? The person receiving the payment, and being able to identify double spends from their end is pretty trivial, really.
Yeah. My argument has always been that from a merchant's point of view, knowing about a double spend is as good as preventing it from happening. It's like someone trying to pay you with a counterfeit note, where it's got the word counterfeit scrawled across it in big red letters. The merchant just doesn't accept it. And merchants have a huge range of tools available to them. They can insist that the transaction subscribes for a double spend, and the mechanism that I'm talking about for that situation just involves adding an op return with a certain set of data tags to it. They could insist on other things as well. They could say, the transaction shouldn't have more than X ancestors, and none of the ancestors should be weird weird script types or whatnot. It's up to a merchant to decide what they deem to be acceptable payment.
Yeah, well, it would also be absurd to put like a restriction on. I mean, payments are so different and varied, right? A car payment, or buying a car, is a lot different than buying a coffee, and the security risks around those 2 things are quite different, right? So it would be a little absurd to put one unilateral rule over all those types of payments.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, I totally agree. And you're buying a car, you can't really buy a car without showing some identity. So you'd be kind of crazy to be attempting fraud in a situation like that.
The paperwork usually takes more than 10 minutes too. If I
And I mean to use a old world analogy, if you went and bought a car with a check, and your plan was that you were going to get away with it by bouncing the check, well, most car yards are not going to accept that. They're going to wait for the check to clear before they'll let you walk away with the car. And even if they did, they know where to find you. So
or buying a house, it's like it's not as simple as walking in and walking out. So there's plenty of intermediaries.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I like to say Bitcoin was designed to solve real problems, not non-problems and made up problems. It's really easy to kind of describe a scenario where you think that Bitcoin might not work as you would want it to be, but you always have to ask yourself, would this realistically happen in the real world, and what would the normal mitigation be if you were doing this with cash?
But it is crazy that from a higher level, we went from, like, when we first did that video with you and Daniel in 2018, we went from like a complete 6 months after that, it was like none of these conversations were happening, where these like really absurdly philosophical questions about what Bitcoin could do, and these weird things that didn't actually exist in reality. And like, was that a sigh of relief for you, I guess, even though the split was really painful? I remember kind of having like a sigh of relief when I was like, okay, at least we all kind of agree on this stuff now,
Well, yeah, that was I think leading into the hash war, I kind of wished it wasn't going to happen. It was very quick, very soon after the hash war. I looked and went, you know what, that was probably the best thing that could have happened to us, because it put an end to all the arguments. Everybody who didn't agree with the direction of SV, because we were very clear about what it was. We gave everyone a clear choice, had Bitcoin Cash to go and do whatever it was that they wanted to do there. And, we'd been really clear that the protocol was off the table. And if you want to tweak protocol, Bitcoin Cash is the place to go and do it. Or you can go and try your luck with BTC Core if you like as well. So, yeah, most of these arguments didn't happen. Most of the sky falling in scenarios didn't happen. The biggest argument against just increasing the block size limit to 128 meg blocks was, what if someone mines a 128 meg block? Yeah. What will we do? Well, we kind of expected that. We wanted that to happen. So,
could you, I guess real quickly before we get to the last piece of the new update, you mentioned, so I guess the Doublespend features of the new release kind of are targeting the recent events that happened on SV with the reorgs and all that kind of stuff. I guess two things. Number one, there's a lot of misconceptions that the reorgs that were happening didn't contain Doublespend transactions, but my understanding is that they did contain like millions of dollars of Doublespend transactions. So could you comment on that? And then the second piece is this proof that selfish mining is a real thing? Could you talk about that? Because everyone's calling this a selfish mining attack as well. Or not everyone, but there's a lot of people in BTC land that mention that.
I mean, if you wanted to characterize it as a selfish mining attack, it would be a failed one. No, I wouldn't call it a selfish mining attack, because the goal of selfish mining is to manipulate difficulty and the proportion of blocks found by different miners in order to advantage the selfish miner. I don't think that's not what was happening here. There was a bit of funny timestamp manipulation going on, but it appeared that they were actually shooting themselves in the foot and moving the timestamps in the wrong direction and making their lives a little bit harder. But even if it had, the response of the miners in this case, it would have probably been a similar response, and it would have demonstrated that selfish mining is just a stupid idea, because all it takes is miners to recognize what's happening. It's extremely easy to detect selfish mining, and just choose to ignore that miner. You need a long ramp-up period of selfish mining where you're actually going to be losing money before you can start to make profit under the scenario that Eamon describes in his white paper. So, it's almost like it's almost like dropping a letter in the letterbox of a house saying, look, I'm going to come and burgle you in 3 weeks. Here's where I live. Please don't do anything about it. And please make sure you're not home. When I come, it's that sort of level of silly. On double spends, there certainly were double spends. Like, that's a simple fact to verify. You look at a block on one chain, you look at a block on another chain, you can see that there are different transactions spending the same inputs. Who owned all of those transactions? Who was actually getting double spent? It's not something that we can say with certainty for all of them. There was one exchange that put their hand up and claimed to have lost some funds. I never saw mathematical proof of that or whatnot, but we definitely know that significant amounts of money were being spent to one address in one chain, and then to another address in another chain. That in itself, I think, is enough of a cause for concern. The fact that it was being done by mining these blocks and keeping them hidden for long periods of time, of course, is more suspicious. So the only other theory that I guess it was a theory that I toyed with for a while, is this someone just trying to create a media incident, to cause reputational harm? But it seems like a lot of money to spend to do that.
So maybe I'll theorize for you then off the top. So I guess my thought process this whole time was that it was some kind of media stint, but I mean, we're probably talking tens of millions of dollars spent on it, which to me would, the only reason I could think to do that is maybe if you had hundreds of millions of dollars that you're trying to maybe like wash or something, or that's interesting. So
So I guess there's the cost of the attack, and then there's the value of the coins that were being moved around. Well, we also don't know if it's the same, same value being moved many times over, because you can calculate the total number of coins that had ever were double spent during the period, and it could be that's the actual amount that was being played with, but it could also be the same coins being reused and whatnot over and over again. But the cost of the attack is the hash power cost to produce these blocks, because obviously they did it alone because they were doing it in secret and then releasing the blocks. And the first couple of times they tried this on, they were quite short chains, 4 or 5 blocks, and that's not a significant cost. Then they came back sometime later and had to mine some significantly longer chains because exchanges had moved their confirmation limits up. And so, we're talking about chains of blocks 80 long, etc. So the hashing cost alone of those is 100K or more. And that seems like a lot of money to spend for a media stunt. If you think that you're going to gain more money than that as a result of whatever fraud you're trying to attempt, then maybe that makes it worthwhile. But the interesting thing is, once a long chain of blocks got ignored and orphaned, I think they did subsequently try again straight away, but they got a bloody nose a second time. They haven't tried it again. So that suggests to me that the very substantial economic loss that they suffered was enough to make them think twice about it. Maybe this was something that actually had to happen on Bitcoin once so that people could see what the potential outcome was, in order to make future attackers think twice about it.
Is that kind of attack, is it easier with the difficulty adjustment algorithm the way it is right now? I mean, if you targeted it at a certain time, could you, because I guess my point being, if the exchanges are putting like a variable number of blocks and the target is I have to get 80 blocks or something, there's probably a point in time where it'd be easier to get those 80 blocks on BSV than on BTC right now, just because of the adjustment algorithm. Is that accurate?
Yeah, because the difficulty adjustment algorithm does adjust block by block at the moment. Obviously, that's not the original DAA, and it's not what we intend long term. But it does mean that it sort of has these fluctuations. So it doesn't make a huge difference, but you can pick a point in time to kind of optimize for that. But the timing of blocks isn't always reliable anyway, even under the old algorithm. It's meant to be stable over a long period.
Right.
But if you've got rising hash rate, for example, at the beginning of a 2-week period, the blocks are probably going to get mined at 10-minute intervals. But as the hash rate increases, the intervals will get shorter and shorter until the next adjustment. Yeah, but it does highlight the difference between block count and time. In fact, it's one suggestion that we make to exchanges if you are counting, relying on number of confirmations as a risk metric. I actually recommend that you combine that with a time-based metric as well. So let's say, for argument's sake, an exchange wants 6 confirmations. By the usual math, that would equate to about an hour. If you get 6 confirmations and you got the first one of those 3 seconds before you got the 6th one, that's probably a red flag. To say, hey, something is odd. So, if I were implementing a check like that, I'd say, okay, well, it's 6 confirmations. I expect 6 confirmations to happen in 60 minutes. I'll flag it, if it's less than 30 or something like that. Or I might just make them wait. Say, like, you can't take it until at least 30 minutes have passed. Yeah. And
Yeah.
in situations like that we're doing bags of time for exchanges to check, have there been any webhook calls from the node or anything like that, and they can determine whether it just happens to be a few blocks happen to be found in rapid succession, or is there some other reason to look closer.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. So then let's just cover the third piece. So the possibility to freeze transaction outputs. The feature is designed for these double spends to freeze transactions that are used by double spends. Could you talk about maybe the details about how that works?
So as someone who's had some Bitcoin nicked before, I've looked into what usually tends to happen after fraudulent events with coins quite a bit. And what tends to happen is they move a lot and they split and they go through this process called peelbacks, where you start with 100 BSV or something, and there'll be 100 transactions in succession that separate off one BSV at a time. And there's a few kind of well-known techniques, I guess, that they use to try and muddy the picture. And of course, they will try to mix transactions with other people's transactions as well, as much as possible. We found following some of these chains, they actually ended up in some being mixed up with some well-known BSV applications and services. So, it's just one more tool, I suppose, at the miner's disposal to say, if you catch them early on, you can really slow down the movement of the transactions. And especially if you can automate it and say, look, there's a process here. We've got two different blocks that spend two different versions of this transaction. As a miner, I'm not going to allow any of these to be moved in my blocks for the next 24 hours or however long. At least give people a chance to find out, figure out what's going on, file reports with police authorities, whatever, if necessary, get an injunction if needed, etc. So, that tool is there. Whether miners will use it or not, I don't know. The policy freeze is the option that we actually, have published the help files on, and is the only one that we recommend people use right now, because any individual miner can simply choose not to include certain transactions in their blocks. So that it's other miners may, but yeah. We've actually seen this happen in real life before as well on BTC. There was a miner called DMG, a Canadian miner, that announced this late last year, or maybe it was earlier this year, that they had actually implemented a system to block certain transactions that were on, I think the US, is it called OFAC blacklist or something like that. They wouldn't include those transactions in their blocks. So. Ironically, BTC set the precedent for us.
Sure. Well, and wasn't this what Satoshi mentioned the alert key for? I mean, there's the alert key to alert to specific transaction outputs, but this isn't even doing this automatically, right? This is kind of just a way in the node to add it to the policy blacklist. It looks like.
The alert key was there initially to be able to broadcast network-wide messages, and I guess put people on an alert state. As a mechanism, it has the potential then to trigger other things, and the implementation of it only triggered a very sort of limited number of things. But that's not to suggest that wasn't the intent to extend upon that. This is one of those things that an alert key, the policy blacklist is one of those things that an alert key might be able to trigger, for example. And, policy blacklist is useful because it doesn't block a transaction from moving entirely, because someone might ignore it and mine a block, and the miners will accept that. But if you get 95% of the hash rate moving, that means that these peel-off transactions and whatnot can only actually get into a block, very occasionally, and it can dramatically slow down the the movement and the mixing of these sorts of coins. Some coins that we've seen go from one double spend output to millions and millions of UTXOs have a connection to them in a fairly short space of time.
So would you imagine? I mean, like if we're talking, let's say I'm a random node on the network, and if I received this request to add it to like a policy block, I'd probably expect like a double spend proof associated with it or something, right? I mean, so I can see how these would all be working together, right? Because I'm not just gonna, if someone says to freeze a transaction output with no other information, or let's say it came from, let's say the alert key is used for this, I would probably accept it if I had an alert key from like the US government, for example, to freeze a transaction output. But a random alert to do this, I probably wouldn't accept, right? So I guess these things all kind of work together in a way of.
And I guess how they work together is not necessarily a entirely resolved question, and it's not necessarily even a question for the Bitcoin SV team. When you provide a tool to I don't know, speed up the engine of a car, or increase the power of the engine of a car, there's other factors that go into deciding whether or not someone's going to apply that tool to their particular engine. There's business process, there's legal ramifications, all sorts of things. And I don't think it's the SV node team's job to try and determine what all of those should be. But a node choosing to ignore a UTXO is a personal choice for them. They can choose whatever, they choose transactions that they're going to accept into their block templates all the time on the basis of fee rates and various other policies and things like that. So if they just decide that they don't like a particular UTXO for whatever reason, then they're perfectly entitled to not do that. So
I guess maybe that's the larger point, because if I'm the traditional like ANCAP Bitcoiner, right, I'm like, oh, freeze transaction outputs, that's scary. But it's almost like I can give you a hammer. What you do with the hammer is probably it's all because you built the hammer doesn't really put any motivation into why you built the hammer or anything like that. The hammer can be used to build things. It can be used to hurt people. I guess my point of bringing that up is just, it's really interesting that all these things kind of interplay with each other. But they're valuable, right? I mean, if like you said, if that attack that happened a few months ago now happened again, it sounds like these tools would be pretty invaluable to even if it's succeeded, I guess you could still freeze the coins and turn gold to lead, so to speak, as talked about.
It certainly could have been put to use in quite a few ways and been very helpful in slowing all of that down, slowing down the obfuscation, I suppose, of those things. I guess, I mean, the analogies, you mentioned ANCAP before. I might appeal to the libertarian mindset and say, if I'm a miner, who's got the right to tell me what to do with my node and what transactions I have to mine into a block?
Right. Well, so that could lead us to our next topic pretty well. But that came up a lot. Again, I hate to keep harking back to like 2018, 2017, or but that came up a lot, where it seems like there is like a maybe because this is how Bitcoin's operate for a while, there seems to be the idea that I'm a user, or maybe even I'm a developer, and I demand something from miners, where miners are almost kind of seen as like the public good, right? Where they're so let's take, for example, we'd wanted to talk about like limits, right? So script limits. Let's say the script limit. So if I'm an application and I let's say I create something way beyond the general accepted script limit, and I broadcast that transaction. Well, the fundamental principles of Bitcoin would say the miner has no need to accept the transaction. They can reject any transaction they want. The argument in favor of accepting it would be obviously an economic argument, right? Of these scripts, maybe my application is going to produce these large scripts, but I'm going to have higher fees associated with it, or a ton of transaction volume that justifies accepting these higher scripts. But to cap it all off, I guess limits in general now are not protocol defined. They're not. There's no technical hard cap on the block size even today. There's no hard cap on really any limit. There are soft limits that are imposed probably for security reasons that I'm sure you could talk about. But the ultimate limitations are all minor governed, and that, as I argued in 2017, 2018, and I think anyone with a sense did regarding the block size limit, is that's more of an economic argument for the miner to make, or decision to make for the miner of is the benefit going to outweigh the risk of putting out this larger block, of accepting these larger transactions and things like that. So I think I limited it a bit.
I think when you broadcast a transaction out to the network or send it to a specific miner, you're essentially making the miner an offer. You're saying, look, here is a transaction. You have the means of determining what the transaction fee is that I'm offering. And you can see the characteristics of the transaction, and so you can determine what its cost is to you. If you want to accept that fee, then mine it into a block. If you don't, then don't. And I think that's where some of the misunderstanding arises. It is an offer, and an offer can be rejected. Now, it might be rejected on a purely economic basis, or it might be rejected because of the technical mechanisms that we have to evaluate this sort of stuff. And the technology may have rejected an offer that the operator may have actually wanted to accept. And if that's the case, then it's a case of going and looking at the way things are set up. But I think part of the problem part of the problem that Mappy tried to solve with the fee quote API endpoint, which is going to be updated to a policy quote API endpoint, so that it can include all the policy conditions, is that it was hard to know what the miners actually would accept. And in BTC or BCH world, that's relatively easy to know because they have this concept of standard transactions. You can know it's not going to be accepted if it doesn't meet this very narrow definition of standard transactions. So you can, guess in advance whether it'll be accepted. We don't have that situation with BSV, though. We have this huge variety of possibilities with transactions. So we need to get a little clever about how those negotiations happen. And, when people come along and start doing something that's never been done before, there's a possibility that existing policies are not going to cover it. And if they don't cover it, then the obvious port of call is the miners to say, hey, I'm trying to make this offer. Your automated systems are rejecting it. Will you consider changing some of your settings or whatnot in order to accept it? And at that point, the miner has to do an evaluation and say, okay, well, does this actually make sense? Does it create risks for me? What's the computation cost of processing it? What are they paying? Is that, cover my costs? Is there a profit in it? Does it fit with all of my, my longer term strategic pricing policy? So, we do have to get a bit kind of active in that. But I think that generally the good news is that when you come up with a completely new type of transaction that's never been seen on the network before, you can throw it out on the network and it may well just get accepted. But if it doesn't, you probably only need to go through that process of negotiation with miners once. And then, we have seen that happen recently with a sensible contract. Most of the miners have increased their script limit substantially to accommodate the quite long scripts that they had. And all it really took was a conversation with the miners, which is much more effective than a tweet. And it's happened. And we now have enough miners have made that change, that they represent well in excess of the majority of hash rate. And so I announced at CoinGeek a couple of weeks ago that we would change the default, but that is how defaults which would get changed. It's in response to obvious market demand. It's not something that we as developers choose to do unilaterally.
Well, and I guess maybe that's the important point, right? Because it would be quite dangerous if it's a lot more beneficial from me as if I'm a user or a developer to not have the one central point of failure being you or the SV node team of, God, please increase the size of op return, right? Way back when, if I'm Vitalik, Buterin, or whatever,
Yeah.
It's much more beneficial to me if there's a competitive market of people I can go to say, hey, this miner, will you take this? If not, I'll go to the other miner. And that's probably the whole reason Bitcoin is invented and works the way it does, right? Is that
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, let's not forget why BTC and BCH split in the first place. It was because developers were trying to control protocol parameters. That was our mantra, was the devs. And we repeated it again. The Bitcoin Cash and BSV split was that devs shouldn't be controlling the protocol. The protocol itself is fixed, but the parameters of the protocol and what people, what miners will accept is something that miners have to figure out, between the miners and the users. Yeah.
It would, in some ways, people talk about this, I guess, throughout history. There's a short window if you have like a benevolent dictator, for example, that things might be good, but ultimately it probably is going to cause issues, which we saw in BTC. In BCH, I guess it's ironic that they became what they hated, right? They're like, oh, stop telling the miners what the block size can be, but now let's start telling the miners what they shouldn't be doing for X, Y, and Z. Is that is it hard for you, I guess, maybe for example, you would want to see some soft limit increase, but it's not really up to you. Is that, how did you square that away from going from like the Omri Sachet of Bitcoin SV, or the benevolent dictator, and now you get to do whatever the hell you want, but then ultimately like kind of like rejecting that power, or that's probably frustrating in some capacity. But
well, look, I mean, it's not that hard because it's kind of a shitty power to have. It doesn't really make your life any better having the option to change all of these things. And I've only ever seen that power used to constrain the ecosystem. But on the flip side, even if people think that I do have that power, firstly, I don't. My customer is the miners. I actually answer to them. Not even. I don't think I necessarily even answer to the users of the network. Miners answers to the users, and I answer to the miners. So that's sort of the flow of accountability, I suppose. But we don't want to return to a world where people who aren't economically invested in the outcome of a decision are making those decisions. I spend a lot of time thinking about the security of the network, I suppose. I don't like seeing service outages and things like that, and that might color my decisions, at points in time. Talking about some of these limits that have been an issue lately, some of them actually are there for a reason. They're there because there are ways you can cause, massive resource use on nodes, and limits are not there. Not unique to Bitcoin. If you start spamming Amazon S3 with 1,000 requests per second, you're going to get rate limited. But at the same time, whilst I might express concerns, my job is to register that risk with the miners, not to tell them that they can or can't accept the risk. It's them that actually accepts the risk and gains the reward. Therefore, that's a decision for them. Outsourcing risk is probably the primary cause of some of the most significant financial incidents in history, and I don't know that developers are the best people to be playing with that particular box of matches.
Is it difficult right now to balance the fact that there are three major, I guess four now, major SHA-256 chains, and then you have miners that I mean, largely throughout Bitcoin's history have been passive, but are free
Mm.
to just start mining on the BSV chain right now. A significant amount of hash rate is not on the BSV chain. Is it a difficult point, I guess, in maybe we see BSV as the inevitable one global chain, but there is this like point
Mm.
in history right now where um, the miner, I mean, what, 95% of the mining hash rate or whatever that you see publicly um, doesn't think about these things. Maybe they do behind the scenes that I don't know about. But how, I guess, do you square the point in history where we are, where you kind of have to, sorry, I know I'm kind of rambling here, but like the Bitcoin Cash,
Yeah.
Bitcoin SV fork, it kind of felt like it was still kind of a pulling at certain miners to, in a direction of, hey, this is kind of your responsibility, right? This is supposed to be your responsibility. It's, if you want long-term economic viability, this is the only way. But
Yeah.
it's kind of this weird point where we're at right now, where it still feels like it's kind of dragging along some of these people. And when they do come in, maybe they're going to have no idea what the heck. Oh, you can have a script bigger than pay to public key hash, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there was a potential risk of non BSV aware miners, I suppose, potentially holding back the blockchain. If they have majority hash rate, then and they refuse to increase limits or mine larger blocks or whatnot, they actually make it harder for the BSV aware and friendly miners to expand those limits themselves, through various different mechanisms like orphan risk and a few others. So it is a thing. The fact that there are multiple SHA-256 hash rate, SHA-256 chains in existence, sharing a single pool of hashing units, it does, change the game in some respects, creates risks that otherwise might not exist. It's part of the reason why we haven't changed back to the original DAA yet. But it's also probably highlighted some things, and in fact, very recently, that might have been false assumptions. We saw, it's always been a mantra that a minority hash chain was insecure because someone could come in and 51% attack the hash chain.
Right.
Well, I think we've actually just blown that theory out of the water with what's happened in BSV in the last couple of months. So, yes, they came in, they did it several times, and the miners weren't able to react the first couple of times because this was a new situation. But when they did, and communication channels between BA and different parties, etc., came in, what we saw demonstrated was that some of these classic attacks that have been described and assumed to be, a given over the last 10, 12 years, actually are a hell of a lot harder than people thought. They have a serious cost. If that attacker wanted to continue, they would have had to have continued mining at, essentially indefinitely. They would have ended up having to mine a chain that was competing with all of the other BSV miners indefinitely, because the other BSV miners had just said, we're ignoring that. We're not going to continue, we're not going to switch over at some point and continue supporting that chain. So if you want to support it, keep on going forever. But, that was obviously not what the attacker had in mind. So, if anything, I think we've actually demonstrated that Bitcoin is even more secure than people probably thought, even in a minority hash rate situation.
Sure. I mean, you kind of mentioned it too, but it also probably skews the incentives like way off. If I can go mine BTC and get a reward, if the whole point of mining is this like red queen game, right, where you kind of have to outcompete your competitors and maybe have better bandwidth, things like that, the incentives kind of get skewed anyway if you can just go, piss off and mine BTC, right? It'll be interesting how all of that changes, probably for the better, honestly, if there's one global chain.
I think, yeah, I mean, having one global chain obviously makes things a lot simpler. I don't know. I think sometimes it's interesting, opens some interesting possibilities having somewhere else where you can park hash for a while. it'll definitely become interesting as transaction fees become a bigger and bigger component of the hash rate, and people work out that hash doesn't actually follow price. It follows revenue on chain. Available
Surprised
to
that
a
that
to a
took so
particular
much.
blockchain.
It shouldn't be that hard to figure out that hash follows revenue instead of price, but yeah, I don't know why.
Yeah, but I guess old school miners they do tend to be quite set in their ways, and they just don't change that much. I think the last few months has probably changed the game a lot. But we started talking with some miners earlier in this year about getting them to upgrades and implementing things like the new get mining candidate API that would allow them to mine bigger blocks, and various other improvements that would reduce their orphan risk, etc. And we found some of them were still running the Genesis software, the 1.0.0, and they said we wouldn't have even updated to that if it wasn't for the fact that Genesis was a hard fork. And they said you have to tell us if it's mandatory. So I said, okay, well they're all mandatory from now on. So just keep up to date so that the network can progress.
Interesting.
But they do seem to be waking up and paying a little bit of attention. And recent block rewards with heavily weighted towards transaction fees, I think are making them look and go, hey, what's going on in this BSV world?
Sure. Well, we're an hour in. I don't want to take up too much time here. I feel like keeping these digestible might be better.
I've never been able to sit and watch a 2-hour podcast. So
yeah.
I'm happy to wind it up soon. I'd definitely love to come back and maybe take a bit of a deep dive into some of the elements of Terranode or whatever might interest your listeners or watchers.
Yeah, we'll have to see that whiteboard you've been teasing, and we'll get you drawing some things for us. But thanks
I've actually got the original whiteboard that Terranode was conceived on in my cellar. I've managed to find all the different pieces of it, but I haven't had a chance to put it together yet.
That's where
dragged
you
it halfway
naked
across
in
the
living room
world.
Drawing it out, right? Is that right?
Yeah, funnily enough, that's the part of the story that people seem to focus on so much more than the actual Terranode bit. But yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
You know what the
thanks.
people want. That's what the people want. Yeah.
I hope no one was looking. It was a full moon that night. I hope no one was looking in the window. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, Steve. We'll definitely you'll be recurring here, hopefully. So we'll have you back on. So thanks for taking the time here.
No worries. It's been a pleasure being here.
All right. We'll talk soon.